Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a bit of this is sort of in some ways slightly longer than a week because of, I recorded the last one a little bit earlier in the week because I was about to be away and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, you didn't need any of that preamble. Here are some of the books that I've read this week. So I'll cover these first three fairly quickly because I did a specific wrap up of all of the Goldsmiths winners from the last 10 years of the prize. Three books that I read this week were on that, so I shall talk about them fairly quickly. So the first, The Sunken Land Begins to Rise Again by M. John Harrison, which is a sort of a book that in many ways purposely plays with the idea of what what a book can do and what it's meant to be about, and it sort of almost intentionally leaves things fairly unanswered, which sounds really frustrating but actually sort of works quite well in this book because both characters sort of drift quite a lot through the world, and so it almost has a slightly Waiting for Godot sort of style feel of things being a little bit out of sorts as they go, but largely focuses around two people who are sort of on again off again dating, but are just kind of in the midst of it, kind of, you know, Brexit is happening, various other political things are happening in the background, and these characters are sort of unmoored from all of that in some ways. We also have we have Happy by Nicola Barker, which is the first Nicola Barker book I've read, and it was a really fun and kind of ridiculous book. It's kind of an idea of where there's a sort of future sort of society or what have you, where this main character at least finds his language really quite policed, in the sense of if he sort of seems to be showing too much emotion, or if he's showing expressing any sort of potentially radical thoughts, that's seen as dangerous to this power. But then he starts noticing that, for example, whereas certain words he says show up on the screen as being in certain colours, that starts to drop at certain moments. So he starts to have these moments wondering if something else has changed. And then we get these really cool things happening on the page. I'm going to try and find an example that's just really quite fun, because it just, yeah, so you'll get things like this kind of cathedral that's made out of words and letters and things. You'll get pages that are sort of like this, where there's this kind of design, and basically this thing where it's almost like the book breaks, language breaks, it stops being able to do what it needs to do, and so the whole book kind of starts imploding in its own little way. I found it really engaging and fun and kind of a bit ridiculous, but in a really, really good way. And then last but not least, A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Emma McBride, which is devastating and really quite incredible. I think it's a tough one to get into, and I would recommend, if you're struggling with the physical book, as I was, to try out the audiobook read by Emma McBride herself. It's on Scribd and a few other places, I think, because it's, hearing her read it makes it make a bit more sense, because a key thing in this book is how it purposely breaks language. It will have sentences where it stops sort of, you know, there are full stops in between bits of a sentence that you wouldn't expect, and it seems really broken up. Occasionally later on in the book you get words that are broken up midway through by full stops, and so it's almost like language is just being sort of throttled and changed and sort of stopped in various parts during this book, in the most glorious way, I think, because it really fits the form of this book, which is a young girl going through trauma of various kinds, not only from sexual violence, but also the bullying of her brother and a few other things happening within the family, and these really complicated family dynamics. And so her breaking of language is not only the fact that she's sort of 13 in various parts of this book and can't always fully articulate how she needs to and wants to, but also that language itself becomes meaningless in various parts as well. But yeah, I mean, it's just an utterly heartbreaking book in various bits, and particularly later on in the book where language really starts to break down, I found it really quite moving how this book explores trauma and various other things through language, and through the breaking of language. So words just completely stop being enough. Yeah, and I thought this was really, really Really, really good, if incredibly difficult reading, not only for on an emotional level, but obviously physically this text is just a thing. You know, it's yeah, it's very good. It's very, very good. Keeping with a nice bleak theme, I read Annie Ernaux's Shame, and this book, oof, yeah, okay, so the key premise and the key part at the beginning of this book is that Annie Ernaux's father tried killing his wife, her mother, one day, and so Annie Ernaux basically then has to try and get on with life and try to understand what's happened and why her dad tried to do this, but also tries to live her normal life knowing that this is going on at home, and you know, also being a teenager, and therefore being 12, I think she is, and therefore trying to find her way through life as you do when you're 12 and nothing really makes sense. So yeah, really, yeah, I think this feels in many ways where it kind of sits in terms of the rest of the Annie Ernaux books is sort of, you know, that whole thing of her being this observer from the sidelines and trying to understand the human condition and try to understand humans, and often really struggling to understand them, particularly in a case like this where this sheer bit of violence just seems so out of odds with who she knows both of her parents to be. Yeah, really interesting, if difficult book. And I think, if I'm right, that leaves me only The Frozen Woman as the only Ernaux book that's been translated that I've not yet read, I think, which is a weird thought. I hope November's going well for everybody else, and that you're enjoying reading them. I'm gonna finish with The Frozen Woman next week, I think, and we'll go from there. Next up, I mentioned that I was away, and a lot of that time I was either busy and therefore couldn't read, or was so burnt out and tired because I was in lectures all day that I couldn't really face reading in the evenings. So there were a lot of audiobooks, and these next three books were all books that I thoroughly enjoyed as audiobooks, and yeah, they're really, really interesting. So first up, we have Britons Through Negro Spectacles by ABC Merriman Labor. Or Labour, I can't remember. I did hear this in the audiobook and now I've forgotten. Essentially, this is this part of a series, if you might remember from last year or the year before, that Bernardine Evaristo was sort of part of resurfacing old books that were written by people of colour in Britain, but that didn't really sort of take off in a big way at the time. And so this series of sort of books writing back exposed us also to this glorious book as well, which is called Britons Through Negro Spectacles. And this whole idea of it being through Negro Spectacles is almost like a travelogue kind of style book. So if you imagine all of those, particularly, I mean, it's a commentary on a very specific type of book. All of those books from the past that did things like sort of, you know, a white European man going to a country elsewhere, particularly in Asia and Africa, and commenting on how the people lived. And often it was done in this kind of sense of like, oh, wow, look at how weird they are. Look at how backwards and savage and whatever they are. And these kind of really dehumanizing portraits of people and of whole civilizations. And this is an attempt to redress that and to sort of turn it on its head. And so ABC Merriman Labor here is sort of writing from the perspective of a black man in Britain, looking at British people and saying like, wow, isn't what they do a bit weird? And kind of really examining it and being like, wow, you know, but people work really long hours and they all seem to be a bit upset. Or isn't it strange that they preach this thing, but then this thing doesn't really happen? And it's a satire, just completely mocking not only this sort of sense of this type of travelogue, but also really playing with these ideas of, you know, the black man as the savage, the kind of uncultured whatever kind of person, and instead sort of looking at things that the British might do that wouldn't make much sense. if examined from an outside lens. And I just really enjoyed this. I thought it was really funny, really clever. The observations were incredibly incisive. And as Bernardine Evaristo says in the intro bit to this book, had he been writing, because this book was panned when it came out, people did not like this kind of commentary. And actually, if this book had come out now or maybe 20 years ago, it would have had a very different reception. And so Bernardine Evaristo, I think quite rightly says, this man could have had an incredible writing career had he been born in a different time, because we would be a little bit more ready to receive this message potentially. Next up, I read Kate Lister's A Curious History of Sex. And this is just a really delightfully fun and vulgar book to read. Kate Lister just is clearly having the absolute most amount of fun writing this. It basically seeks to look at sex and sexuality through history. And she, you know, she notes at the beginning, it's impossible to pin every single thing down. And she mostly focuses on Europe, and she mostly focuses on sort of fairly specific time frames. But it's really interesting to see how she charts the transformation of our values and morals around sex, our language around sex, and particularly the words we use for body parts or for sexual acts or what have you, all through this sort of long lens of history. And it's really good fun. At one point she dedicates a whole chapter to the C word, and she she just keeps saying the word, and there is something hilarious about it, particularly when you have it as an audiobook, because you're very, like, as if you're anything like me, you many times checked if your headphones were definitely still connected, because this is maybe not the thing that that it playing in public would be a great thing. But she also, for example, brings in sort of really fun and curious facts from history and bits of trivia about, you know, for example, when certain euphemisms or words were used, and she'll give the sort of the time marker for that as well. So sometimes you'll hear, you know, she'll be like, when somebody wanted to blah, 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 and use a euphemism and then say 1974. And there's something so delightful about this sort of really fun side of history. And I just loved it. I thought it was just such an enjoyable, fun and insightful read. And yeah, I just had a great time with it. And last but definitely not least, A Fortunate Woman by Polly Morland. And this is the story of a country doctor, and particularly I found it really quite profound and quite moving. So the initial idea from this is there was a book by John Berger ages ago called A Fortunate Man that focused in on a country doctor and sort of gave windows into the lives of his patients and the community that he served. And this has sort of been a book that has been taken up by many people in the medical profession, especially as a sort of reminder of how to do really great care, you know, how to involve a community, how to meet people's needs, how to make sure that people feel heard. Polly Morland basically makes friends with a country doctor, and this woman is serving a community in much the same way, and both these women basically bond over the fact that they really loved this book when they were younger. And then as it sort of turns out, as we go through the book, we realise that actually the community that this modern day country doctor is serving is very similar, in fact some of the same houses as were mentioned in A Fortunate Man. And so there's this sort of looking back over what's changed and a bit of a reappraisal in some ways of that old book, with things like, for example, noting where there's a really noticeable absence of the doctor's wife in the original book, who was doing a great amount of this work as well, but had kind of been left out. And so it also looks just so much at, you know, how certain people respond to healthcare and to health more generally. And so, for example, you've got these farmers who don't really want to talk about anything that's going wrong and will make do and mend almost entirely with every single part of their body. So we'll just completely be limping through day to day in excruciating pain just because they don't want to go to the doctor. Or, you know, they won't go to the dentist because they had a bad experience when they were 10 and that's stuck with them ever since. And there's something so brilliant about the way this book is able to not only give those personal stories and really look at them in beautiful detail, but also have a wider lens and look at what the current healthcare system is and isn't doing. So we've seen massive changes in healthcare over the last 50, 60, 70 years, which have been fantastic. But also at the same time, you know, there aren't as many community doctors. So often if you've got a 10-minute appointment, you can't do quite as much and blah, blah, blah. And so I found this book really interesting for how it approaches this, of sort of it's in some ways a call for further and better healthcare and better sort of community support, but at times as well it's also just a really beautiful insight into the human condition, which I found really quite beautiful. So yeah, so those have been the books that I've been reading this week, which I've really loved. There were a good number of 5 stars in there as well, which was fantastic. So I feel very lucky. Yeah, on to another week. I hope you've had a great week. I hope you're keeping really well, and I will speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.